Hey, Cookies here to talk to you about how to heal all of the different tank classes in Mythic Plus content. Starting off with a couple useful add-ons and weak auras. Cooldowns on frames is a weak aura that will display any active mitigation or defensive cooldowns and stuff like that on any player, but it's especially useful for seeing when the tank activates their mitigation. And then we have the Omni CD add-on. This can also be done through weak auras and stuff like that, so I'll link a couple options down below. I personally like Omni CD because it's very simple. So the first thing to talk about when healing tanks is going to be that upkeep spells are super important. Whatever class you're playing, managing your upkeep spells and making sure that those remain on the tank as much as possible, no matter which type of tank you're healing, these are going to be the most important thing to make sure that you're doing to help keep your tank alive. So for Druid, I'm going to run through each class and just kind of give quick fire examples of what these abilities are like. Obviously, this isn't an exact list of the abilities that you need to focus on, but it's the idea. So for Druid, we have things like Life Bloom and Efflorescence. For Mistweaver Monk, we have Renewing Mist. For Holy Paladin, we have Glimmer of Light. For Shaman, we have Earth Shield and Riptide. For Evoker, we have Reversion and Dream Breath. For Holy Priest, we have using Guardian Spirit very early and often with the talent that reduces it to a 60-second cooldown, because Holy Priest doesn't really have a lot of upkeep spells. They're much more of a whack-a-mole healer. I just put using Guardian Spirit because I think a lot of the time people hold on to it way too much to try to save someone's life when that's not necessarily the idea. It's more of an external cooldown rather than a, emergency heal or button like that. And then Discipline Priest, just using Power Word Shield on cooldown pretty much on the tank is going to be really helpful in most cases. And that's pretty much it for all the healers. The only other thing I would say besides upkeep spells is make sure, this kind of goes in line with the Holy Priest tip, is that you want to be using your external and healing cooldowns early and often. That's the other problem I see a lot of the time when reviewing other people's keys or just seeing other people run keys, is that they hold on to everything too much because they're too scared to let go of it. You just have to be willing to just use stuff, and if you make a mistake by using it at the wrong time, that is okay. That's how you learn, and then you adapt and change it up next time. And then, the next time you run that dungeon or in that pull, okay, I need this cooldown for, this specific pull because I know now that it's dangerous without cooldowns, that kind of thing. But if you just always hold your cooldowns, then you're never going to learn where those pulls are because you're just always saving everything for everything, if that makes sense. So it's not a consistent strategy to have, which consistency is very important. All right, so now we're going to talk about each tank individually, and this doesn't include like balance patches or anything like that. So this is going to be just like generalized ideas behind how each of the tanks operate, and then also just some general tips that will pretty much work no matter what patch cycle it is, no matter what the balance is like, no matter how strong or weak this tank currently is. This is how they generally play and what you can do to help them stay alive in a key environment. So first up, we have the Prot Warrior. So some pros about the Prot Warrior is that they absorb damage really well through cooldowns and various buffs that help them mitigate the damage they take. So they have a very smooth damage intake. They don't their health doesn't bob and weave up and down all over the place. It's very, very smooth. The cons, however, to Prot Warrior is that they can't really self-heal, and they also are pretty bad at taking magic damage when they lose Spell Reflect. So once they use Spell Reflect, they take a lot of magic damage. So it's something that they need to be careful of. There is some new talents and stuff like that are now available that let them Spell Reflect like multiple spells and block spells and stuff like this. So it definitely helps a lot more, but that may not always be the case. So some tips for healing Prot Warriors is you want to watch the cooldowns on the Party Frames weak aura. And just see where they have gaps in their active mitigation. So if they don't have shield block, shield wall, or last stand showing on their frame when you have this weak aura, you want to be putting active heals into them or making sure that you are being really on top of keep spells on them, because that's when they're going to be taking the most amount of damage, is when they have what most people refer to as a shield block gap. Awesome. So next up, we have the Prot Paladin. Some pros for Prot Paladin is that they have probably the best tank utility hands down in the game. They have so many things that help the group survive, And they're also very good at self-sustaining themselves. They're good at keeping themselves alive and healing themselves and using utility that kind of gets them out of really bad situations. The cons, however, is that user error makes or breaks this class. So it can feel very unpredictable to heal because you'll play with one prop paladin in a pug group and he'll carry the whole key and like you don't need to heal anyone. He's healing the whole group. He's using his utility. He's staying alive and he's keeping himself alive. And then you'll play with another prop paladin the very next key in the same key level and everything. It's just a different prop paladin and he'll just die nonstop to every pull and not use the utility that he has and stuff like that. So it's something that's very unpredictable. But the way that we can help make this more predictable is we use OmniCD, the add-on, or track the paladin's major cooldowns to see what he has available and see if he's actively using them each pull, and then we can kind of get a feel for how he's playing. And then the main focus when healing a prop paladin, because they're kind of unpredictable and their HP can bob and weave and they can kind of just get one shot out of nowhere, is you want to just focus the most on your upkeep spells like we talked about earlier. So keeping upkeep spells on the prop paladin is going to be a make or break in if they can survive. And then next up we have the Guardian Druid. So some pros to the Guardian Druid is that they are pretty much unkillable during their major cooldowns, their defensive cooldowns that are also turned into offensive cooldowns. And they also have a very high health pool, so they're very good at absorbing damage and giving you enough time to react rather than them just kind of randomly getting one shot. That doesn't happen very often with a Guardian Druid. The cons, however, to Guardian Druid is that they are very, very cooldown reliant. So without their cooldowns, they are extremely weak and will take a lot of damage and also not be able to deal a lot of damage, making the pulls take longer, which makes the pulls more difficult and such, so on and so forth. So the tips for healing Guardian Druid is that you want to use OmniCD to track when the Druid will be doing big pulls versus when they might be doing smaller pulls. So the major cooldowns to track is going to be Incarnation, or it will be Berserk, but it's usually Incarn through talents and stuff like that. And then Bark Skin is the other ability that you want to track. Those are going to be their two main things. If they have Incarn up, they're going to be completely unkillable while it's active. So if you see them use that, you can pretty much just almost ignore them in most cases. And then also if they have Bark Skin, it's not as powerful, but think of it as about like a half Incarn. It's still very strong and still very potent because it absorbs a lot of damage, and through talents it can make them deal a lot of damage, making the pull easier. But other than that, if they don't have those up, that's when you really want to keep an eye on them. And then next up we have the Brewmaster Monk. So the pros to Brewmaster Monk is that they definitely have the smoothest damage intake out of any tank because of the stagger mechanic, and they are also not very based around cooldown usage. They have very smooth damage intake, and they also just don't rely on cooldowns at all. They just kind of always take this reduced damage, and their cooldowns that they do have to absorb damage or mitigate damage are typically very short cooldowns. The cons, however, to the Brewmaster Monk, because of this smooth damage intake and the way that stagger provides them constant mitigation, they then need consistent attention. So you need to be healing them a lot more than other tanks consistently. So you need to be throwing heals into them, or again, using upkeep spells and making sure that those don't fall off. You're going to especially notice if you are not keeping up on the upkeep spells, the Brewmaster is going to be struggling and you're not going to like healing Brewmaster Monk. So the number one tip is upkeep spells. Those are super important with Brewmaster Monk. The other con that Brewmaster Monk has is magic damage. So anytime there's magic damage involved, you really need to give them a lot of attention and even some externals and stuff like that to help them reduce the damage that they're taking, because stagger only works with physical damage for the most part. So the tips I have for Brewmaster Monk healing is going to be to use this Stagger Weakora, which I'll link down in the description, to know when to heal and focus your attention more on healing the Brewmaster Monk. So if the Weakora is green, that means they're not taking very much damage from their stagger, and you can pretty much just have upkeep spells on them and then go about your business. If it's yellow, that means you probably need to put a little bit more then just upkeep spells into them, maybe use an external, or just be watching their HP a little more carefully. And then if it's red, that's when you need to be actively throwing heals into them and actually helping them stay alive until it recovers. All right, so next up we have the Demon Hunter. So the pros to Vengeance Demon Hunter is that they have really good self-sustain. They do a lot of damage typically, and they usually are listening to like 2000s pop punk hits, which I would consider a pro. The cons for Demon Hunter, however, is that they take a lot of upfront damage when they jump into a pull, and they also are usually listening to 2000s pop punk hits, which I would also consider a con. So my tips for healing Demon Hunter tanks is to use externals on them at the start of big pulls rather than during, and also watch cooldowns on the party frames to track Demon Spike usage and Metamorphosis. If the Demon Hunter does not have Demon Spikes active or does not have Metamorphosis active, they are going to be taking an immense amount of damage and they will not be able to keep themselves alive. The way that they survive is Demon Spikes and Metamorphosis. They have nothing else. That is their defensive toolkit, so you need to watch. It's kind of like the shield block gaps with Prot Warrior, just with Demon Spikes, and then Metamorphosis is like their shield wall, essentially. All right, and then last up, we have the Blood Death Knight. The pros to Blood Death Knight is that they are a one-man army, typically. They can just kind of do everything on their own. They are very good at just keeping themselves alive, and they definitely have the best self-sustain in the entire game out of all of the tanks. The cons is that they can be very unpredictable to heal, even more so than like a Prot Paladin, and they take a lot of upfront damage when they go into a pull, because if they're starting out a pull and they have nothing going already from like chain pulling or something, they have to build up a lot of different buffs and debuffs on the enemy in order to actually become tanky. So they start squishy and then they become more tanky the longer that they're fighting and the longer they build up their resources. So the tips I have for healing Blood DK is use the Runic Power Tracker Weakora, which I'll have linked in the description, to know when to heal them. So this will show very similar to the Stagger Weakora on Monk. It'll show as like, it'll just track their runic power, and if the icon is gray, that means that they probably need healing, or they need externals because they don't have their resources built up yet. And then if it is a colored icon and it's above like say 75, they are totally in the clear and you have nothing to worry about until that drops down and they've used their resources. Then the other tip I have for healing Blood DK is you want to use externals at the start of big pulls rather than during the big pulls, because like we said, the Blood DK is going to be really good at tanking once they get going. So all you need to do is help them get going when they start a pull, and then as soon as they're going, you can it's pretty much going to be up to them to keep themselves alive, because that's just the way the tank works, or the tank class works. And then you just keep an eye on the Runic Power Weakora in case, it dips below a certain amount, and then you can just be like, okay, now I throw some more heals on them and help them out. But everything should pretty much be mostly up front when they get into a pull. And I think that covers pretty much every tank in the game until they make Enhancement Shaman a tank. But until then, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.